before I jump in, I wanted to first point out that I have 2,000 subscribers, which I never thought I'd have. Kind of thought I'd be just in the hundreds for a while, but that's 2,000 subscribers in a year. I think that's pretty good. I must be doing something right. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, I wanted to talk about trans eggs, because that was something that I mentioned in my previous video, which I had posted about a month ago, and I wanted to explore it a little bit. And in this video, I'm not exploring all avenues of it. I'm pretty much just focusing on mostly just one. There's many other aspects to it, but what I'm primarily focusing on are the males, which I know people are going to get upset about. Before I elaborate on that, first of all, I wanted to define what trans eggs are. Trans eggs are basically trans people who are in denial of being trans, and so they believe that they're cis. They've had signs of being trans for their entire life. They just denied that they were signs or didn't know it at all. My definition of trans eggs, however, is someone who's gender non-conforming and likely kind of feels bad about gender non-conforming and being a little, different from the norm, but trans people project their idea of what trans is onto them. So whatever the trans people experience for their coming out to themselves as trans, they put it onto these vulnerable, impressionable, usually young, gullible people. The reason why I wanted to make this video, I wanted to explain why there's a lot of people, myself included obviously, who believe that trans egg culture stuff is so toxic and grooming individuals who would otherwise grow out of, or not even that, but just like it wouldn't even cross their mind to be trans if they were just never exposed to it to begin with, and they would live happily as cis. My outline for this whole video is explaining a couple points of how the trans community handles people who they deem as trans eggs. The main things that they'll point out are internalized transphobia, indirect dysphoria, sex appeal or paraphilia, impostor syndrome. This is all in an attempt to crack the shell of the trans egg, which would mean the egg is finally coming out as trans. And before I get into this, I wanted to preface this by saying that I will mostly be focusing on autogynephilia, obviously therefore males, and really the reason why I'm starting with them is because, number one, they are the most popular, I find. When I was searching through posts of am I trans on r/ask transgender, it would primarily be men, and then one of them out of all of the ones that I read was female. And then there's a lot of posts on egg in real life, and I'm sure they pronounce it like trans r/trans, and it's just mostly dudes putting up anime girl photos and stuff, and then they'll be like, "Ooh, this is me," and I embody the energy of this anime girl, basically. So what I'm saying is that there's a shit ton of it. It's mostly the males who go around talking about it, and that's why I'm talking about it first. And because they talk about it more, therefore there's more information out there about it. That's why. It's not because I want to attack trans women in particular or autogynephilia. It's just, that's just what's there first. I want to say that I am not judging anybody with autogynephilia, nor am I judging anybody with autoandrophilia. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong. I don't think there's anything inherently misogynistic about autogynephilia. I don't think there's anything inherently misandrist with autoandrophilia. It's really all a matter of who the person is and what their intent is behind it. But I just don't think as a concept it's inherently like evil or bad. So I'm not judging it. I'm just sorting through it and making connections. But anyway, let's get to our first point, which is redefining dysphoria, or otherwise indirect dysphoria. So the trans community, when it comes to trans eggs coming up and being like, am I trans? They'll invent new definitions of what dysphoria is. One example right away, I can say that I've seen people who are asking the question, am I trans? They'll say they don't want to be trans because they find that being trans is hard. They also know very well that they cannot be the opposite sex no matter what they do, even if they have bottom surgery. That will not make them the opposite sex at all. The trans community will take that and they'll say, well, that's just what dysphoria is. That's what trans people feel all the time. They lament the fact that they'll never be the opposite sex. Another example would be from a cis person, or an egg, would be, I wouldn't mind staying as a guy, but I'd rather be a girl. Or like, if I could choose, I would be a girl. Another example, if I could press a button that would irreversibly make me the opposite sex, I'd press it. Another example, I wish I had dysphoria because then I could transition. Another example, if something different sounds like an improvement to you, the trans egg, those would be indicators of dysphoria, which I completely disagree with, because they're changing the very definition of what dysphoria is just to suit their narrative and cause further doubt of your identity. I looked up the etymology of what dysphoria is, and it's dys, which means hard or bad, plus, I think you pronounce this Farron or Farian, I don't really know, but that is to carry, and therefore this would be put together, hard to bear, hard to carry. In other words, like difficulty. It causes strain. Someone else I was watching a video said dysphoria is misery, and I agree with that. That's what it is. And these qualifiers that I had pointed out with my examples, these are very casual, lighthearted, the complete opposite of hard to bear. And I'm not saying that gender dysphoria is a requirement for transition, because you could have gender dysphoria, transition, grow out of it, and then detransition anyway. I'm just pointing out how coercive this idea is. Indirect dysphoria is often talked about by Zinnia Jones. He's a trans woman who loves writing essays about dysphoria and like the trans experience and stuff, mostly geared toward trans eggs and people who are just cracking and whatnot. From my perspective, he seems to really want eggs to be paranoid about their identities by pointing out the most subtle signs of gender dysphoria and being trans, which are very, very extremely normal for cis people to experience and think about. But he's saying, no, that's not normal. Only trans people think of this. And that's just a really horrible thing to say, and it's just untrue. You're lying. He tries to argue that because the word dysphoria is so ambiguous in its meaning, therefore means that everything can basically be translated into gender dysphoria and can be trans-related. Essentially, what he's trying to propose is that and he wouldn't use these words, I'm using them. It's the hypochondria of transgenderism, like mistaking your stress and anxiety, your psychosomatic symptoms, in other words, as a sign you have cancer and you're dying, which I know very well. Hypochondria, well, on the one hand, you really don't want to have the disease. On the other, as odd as it sounds, you kind of do. It's about proving to yourself that you're right about your own paranoia. Like, you don't want to be thinking about these things and kind of be wrong in a way. Like, I think ultimately you wouldn't really want to have, like, a brain tumor or something that WebMD would show you, but there's a little bit of a little thought in there being like, oh, but what if it is real? I kind of want it to be true in a way. It's weird. For trans paranoia, you don't want to be trans, yet you kind of secretly want to be trans in a way. And in the case for trans eggs, you have the added element of desperately wanting to fit in and be part of a community, to ward off your loneliness. So there is a bit more of a push of, I want to be trans, actually. Indirect dysphoria really gets into, it just digs its claws into the most paranoid among us. And it's just, I'll get into it a little bit more later on, but let's just continue going on with my points. I've noticed that there is a sense of sex appeal within, like, trying to kind of catch the attention of certain people who would, in retrospect, call themselves eggs. And this part is also addressing autogynephilia and touching a little bit on autoandrophilia. And let me just define what it is. I could have defined it later, but it's more relevant right now. Autogynephilia was a term coined by Dr. Ray Blanchard in the 1980s, and trans people have picked it apart left and right. Whether there's validity to it or not, they picked it. And do I agree with it? Some bits here and there, yes, I do agree with it, but I don't think his theories were so completely out of reality that we can't consider them as a possibility. Anyway, so he found in his studies that straight males who desire to be trans-identified are motivated by their intense sexual attraction toward women to the point where he wants to embody and fashion himself in the likeness to women, and then he, like, gets off on that. So it has this air of, oh, well, that man is perverted what he's doing. And so that has made trans women who have autogynephilia are like, you make me look like a pervert and like a horrible person. And so it's like, I can see why trans women have a lot of issue with it. They find that the whole concept of autogynephilia dismisses their trans identity, calls them a pervert, makes them just look like they're misogynistic. Obviously, like, who wants to be accused of that? So I totally get their tension with it. However, that all being said, many times when an autogynephiliac who's like cis asks the trans community if they're trans, the community tends to tell him that, like, being a trans woman starts out as a fetish, and then that develops into a trans identification. Whereas if that same person was to ask a group of other cisgendered autogynephilic males, they would likely just tell him that he needs to reduce his porn intake, his exposure to it, and get, like, professional help. Not gender help, but just sex addiction sort of help. I just noticed that there's a pretty big juxtaposition between r/AGP and r/as transgender. And the trans people will be like, oh yeah, you're probably trans. But then the AGPs are like, oh, well, you could be. I mean, maybe if you ask some trans people about it, then maybe. But I kind of think you don't. I just, it doesn't sound like you're trans. But autoandrophilia is essentially the same thing, only in reverse. And I would say I was part of that camp when I was for flamboyant, obsessive straight girls. As trans, I was on that kind of, I guess, spectrum of autoandrophilia. I'm not sure who founded the term, but I'm sure it was very much inspired by Ray Blanchard's work. The trans community is no stranger to this concept, and they will also kind of do the same thing to autoandrophilic women who come on and they're asking, hey, am I trans? Then the trans community might be like, oh, maybe, because it starts out as a fetish. What a autogynephilic trans person will tell to a autogynephilic cis person who's coming in with the am I trans question, like they'll basically justify it and say that how could it really be AGP and a fetish when once you get on testosterone blockers and estradiol, I think that's how you pronounce it, your libido will lower. Sometimes your fantasies / porn addiction disappear. I think that's pretty great. Like, if that's what you wanted, your porn addiction to go away, like, fine, you know, I guess Bob's your uncle or something. But you can't dismiss the fact that it started out as a fetish. It's not a sign of repressed gender identity. Because, I mean, first of all, women do not fetishize themselves. And, you know, neither do men. Men and women alike do not fetishize wearing certain clothes. They don't fetishize having sex with who they're sexually attracted to. They just have normal fantasies. Whereas with, like, AGP and AAP, which is autoandrophilia, you are turning yourself on by the thought of being this, whereas being, I guess, by this example, a straight male, you just don't like the idea of it because you don't feel like you match the male role. That's just not realistic. That's not what happens. My theory is that the reason why your porn addiction disappears after you come out to yourself as trans is because you finally found an outlet for your misery. You found a purpose in life, whereas you didn't have one before. I'm saying that you could have discovered any other meaning and purpose in your life unrelated to transgenderism, and your porn addiction would have disappeared. Porn addiction and addictions in general are vices in order to run away from your problems, so you can self-soothe or self-medicate with porn. This is a bad coping mechanism. Transgenderism feels like a solution because of how successfully it distracts you from your deep inner agony. Trans AGPs will claim that they were born this way, born to want to be feminized and girly. And while I don't dispute that everyone is born under a certain disposition, like being submissive or dominant, or a switch, or preferring like certain colors and patterns and clothes, like chemical things that make you attract to certain things, I feel like I can dispute that you were born girly as a male. Many trans AGPs develop their paraphilia due to shame, and that shame builds up into an addiction. Without shame, you wouldn't feel the need to fixate on it at all, really, because if there's no problem, then there's nothing to fix. Trans ID seems to lift that shame, but in reality, it's just a band-aid with social acceptance, because there's an entire community ready to validate your feelings. The alternative to this would be seeing a sex therapist who will work with you to reduce or cure your sexual shame, but the trans community isn't really going to address that. They think any alternative is conversion therapy, and they really don't want to do that. I've noticed that with AGP eggs, they are strongly and more commonly attracted to transitioning, because with the subreddit Egg in Real Life, they get pulled into trans culture because AGP transsexuals post on there with their own paraphilia that attracts the AGP eggs who still believe that they're cisgendered. What ends up happening is that the AGP egg is pro-trans rights. They're a bleeding heart for the trans community. And they stay on the subreddit not only to support and learn more about like how to support trans people, but also there's paraphilia appeal within it. There's sex appeal within these subs. Because that's the whole thing about like, oh, I want to be forced into feminization, and that's kind of what trans kind of entails a little bit, especially with Egg in Real Life and all the memes, and it's all fun. It seems lackadaisical, fun, harmless. It just a bit of, lighthearted fun, playing. It's playful. These guys don't go into it thinking, oh, I'm trans, I want to be trans, I want to change my mind, please change my mind. Like they go into it just thinking, oh, I'm going to be supportive. But the more that they look at it, and the more that they get exposed to these things, and the other AGP transsexuals who talk about their dysphoria, the more the AGP egg is going to relate in some ways and adopt their own dysphoria. In my last video, I mentioned the power of suggestion, which again, I want to make its own video. The nocebo effect is present here as well. So if everybody around you who you sympathize with is experiencing these negative feelings, the egg, if you will start developing it as well, because they'll start relating to some of those things. Furthermore, especially if you're a white, cis, heterosexual male, but really any cishet, because according to the Oppression Olympics, you're on the lowest tier. You're pretty much trash. But if you're one of those, and a bleeding heart for the trans community, you have no voice, and your opinions don't matter. This makes you, the cishet ally, desire eventually to be trans because you want to be heard and respected. PhilosophyTube is a perfect example of this. He was told pretty much to shut up anytime he would bring up trans stuff because he's cis. And he eventually turned trans just so he could be heard. Among other reasons, but that's, I'm pretty sure, is the main one. You'd think what you've been bullied about wouldn't make you want to persist and be that thing, but apparently that's just how it works. If you have body dysmorphia as an egg, the trans community preys on that. If you have negative feelings about being gender non-conforming, or especially GNC and homosexual, they'll prey on that. Or if you're bisexual too, they'll also prey on that. I know some people are probably thinking that, oh, well, that's just the trans community trying to help that poor, hapless individual who just really needs help. They came on here wanting the answers. Like, no. that cis person coming on asking for help or whatever, or just coming into the community, they will be harassed and bullied into being trans, as I was saying. They will try very hard to convince you that you're trans just because they determined that you are gender non-conforming enough to be trans. Like, anything GNC is assigned to them, they will stalk, catcall, sexually harass you. And God forbid you had told them about your body dysmorphia, or, body image issues, or your fetishes. If you are a people pleaser, lonely, and want to desperately be liked, It's not surprising you'd succumb to the community's bullying, and that's why people turn. That's why PhilosophyTube turned. Moving on to Internalized Transphobia. This one's probably the worst out of them all. And so this is where you deny you're trans, that you feel you wouldn't be a successful trans person, you'll never pass, that you can't be a lesbian because you're a guy, that it's all just a fetish, or you have internalized misogyny, or some of the other reasons that detransitioners will put out there for what they have. If you hate the idea of being trans, but you still struggle with your femininity as a male or masculinity as a female, then you are harboring internalized transphobia. So basically, the image that we're seeing here is a man cannot embrace his femininity and subsequently be cisgendered. He has to be trans because men don't embrace their inner femininity, apparently. And, vice versa for women. Internalized transphobia is loathing the idea that you might be trans because you are a slightly or very effeminate guy or masculine gal and are ashamed of being gender nonconforming. There's something extremely suspicious to me about the idea that GNC feelings seem to be mistaken for trans feelings, and that you can't be an effeminate guy, you're a girl, because other girls experience these interests and behaviors exclusively. It's taking a GNC person's shame about being GNC and making them think they're trans. Because it's easier to be a feminine lady than it is to be an effeminate man. Being trans-identified is a band-aid to GNC person's shame for being different. Instead of fixing their shame and accepting that they're gender non-conforming, they are told that they hate themselves and would feel better altering their bodies, usually medically. Internalized transphobia is absolutely piggybacking off of internalized homophobia, which is denying that you're homosexual and feel deeply ashamed of your attraction to the same sex. Internalized transphobia is, in reality, denying that you are perfectly acceptable as a masculine female or an effeminate male, which, as I said in my last video, homosexuals are more likely to be gender nonconforming, and they are the main demographic to believe that they are trans, which suggests that internalized transphobia is actually just homophobia, because it's saying that you're not allowed to be gay and GNC, but hetero passing, which is deeply ironic given the fact that trans people hate cis-hets, despite the fact that they want to be cis-hets themselves so badly. Obviously, the loophole would be, oh, but what about the straight males who identify as lesbians? They would be making lesbians heterosexual, and that's what makes that homophobic. What makes the whole internalized transphobia really insidious is that it denies you the ability to doubt and say no to it. If you deny that you are trans, then that must mean that you are trans. And when eggs are slightly considering that they might be trans, they are already sympathetic toward gay people. They don't want to be hateful toward a marginalized group. So by extension, they don't want to be hateful toward trans people. Internalized transphobia targets your self-hatred for reasons beyond trans ID, but it's mistaken as gender dysphoria, and suggests to you, if you hate yourself, you hate all trans people. So stop doing that. This idea really fucks up people with obsessive and intrusive thoughts, because they will be hyper paranoid. They won't be able to get themselves out of these thought loops without help. They will constantly ask themselves, well, what if I don't transition, then something bad's gonna happen to me. And especially without any readily available resources to thoroughly question the trans identity, they will pretty much think trans is the only way, which is why we need more resources available for everybody. Second to last point, impostor syndrome. Impostor syndrome is regarding the feeling of not being trans enough, that you feel like you're faking it, being fear of being fake trans. Like, a question would be, is this really me? Like, is my true self really the opposite sex? If you don't desire medical transition, you might feel fake. If you don't experience gender dysphoria or euphoria at all or often, you might be fake. So what is fake trans and why do eggs fear it? While Two Cutes will tell you that there's no right or wrong way to be trans, there's still tons of pressure by true scum and trans meds to present yourself in a certain, especially binary way. Fake trans is primarily defined by true scum as you don't have gender dysphoria, you do nothing to indicate that you are visibly trans, so you don't dress androgynously, or you don't dress as a very stereotypically male or female. You are just a fetishist, a chaser, someone who will detransition later in life. You may feel fake if your body doesn't make you miserable, or that you didn't discover you might be trans until later in life. Unlike other trans people who claim that they were trans at the age of like 2 up to 5. When it comes to imposter syndrome, a lot of people outside of the trans thing, they experience it because they feel they haven't earned the title of whatever that thing is, and in this case it's being trans. We hadn't gone through the same path as others might have before us, or if we did, we felt like we did so through fraudulent means. That right there is a sign of low self-worth and feelings of being undeserving, that we aren't worth that title. Many trans meds would agree with me on this. Sometimes, in my opinion, a creeping doubt is justifiably present. Referencing back to my first point of indirect dysphoria, that is fraudulent because you're tricking yourself into having dysphoria. If you're a real trans person, you wouldn't have to trick yourself. You wouldn't have to think that deep. You'd probably just know, maybe. And I have an example of trans people trying to falsify an egg's imposter syndrome. The quote is, "If you have thoughts of being trans repeatedly, it must mean you're trans because cis people never think about their gender. This is just empirically false. It's an outright lie. Because cis people in this day and age now, and for like the past maybe decade, they have been thinking about their gender a lot because of the whole trans influence, and especially today, it's basically everywhere. Trans is almost literally everywhere. You almost can't escape it. And therefore, how could you not pause and consider maybe I am trans? And like, granted, there are cis people who think about it a little bit maybe, and then they dismiss it, and they think, I'm pretty comfortable in my masculinity or my femininity, and I don't think I'm trans, I think it's fine. Yes, those people certainly exist. But then there are other people, other cis people who cling to this idea, and they think about it ad nauseum, and they worry themselves sick. What if I'm trans? And these sorts of people have obsessive compulsive disorder, or trans OCD, TOCD for short, or autism spectrum disorder, which also has obsessive thinking, or any other condition that makes you have obsessive or intrusive thoughts, kind of like hypochondria, and that's what I had. The idea that cis people don't think about being the opposite sex is further hogwash, because detransitioners who are claimed to be cis by the trans community have obsessively thought about being the opposite sex to the point of going through with medical transitioning. How can they be cis if they question their identity? Trans people just claimed that cis people don't think about these things. So therefore, it's a logical fallacy to claim that no cis person obsesses over being the opposite sex or trans, and to claim that detransitioners were cis the entire time. That doesn't make any sense. So my last point is ROGD, which is rapid onset gender dysphoria. Also, I want to apologize that it's getting dark. I don't plan very well, okay? I had battery issues. It's getting dark, so I'm gonna like wrap this up real fast. So all this stuff that I pointed out, and there's more, but we might get to that in another video. All this winds up with the trans egg cracking and coming out of their little shell, and they have this sudden flood of gender dysphoria. The reason why that's happening is that they are suddenly aware that they are in the wrong body. That their body is wrong because it's not feminine passing as a guy, or it's not masculine passing as a girl. Another element added to this phenomenon is seeking social acceptance and fitting in, obviously. Again, kind of like what I said, if other people are experiencing misery, you want to feel misery so that you'll be like, oh yes, I also am trans and I have dysphoria. Please believe me. Please accept me into your coven. RGD means you either had zero interest in opposite sex stuff, or you were very happily a tomboy or a Jane girl. You never really cared about gender at all until you either happened upon it on the internet, you were talking with your counselor at your California school or New York school, or you were in therapy and your therapist brought it up, or just it came out some way, or you met a trans person who is relatable enough to you, and then that made you believe that you're the opposite sex based on some subtle or very obvious gender nonconforming behaviors that you have, something you once believed was normal or not any point of contention within you. I know many viewers watching are thinking, well, ROGD is just you facing the music that you're trans. You were always trans, you just didn't know it. Or you simply deny that the concept is even a thing at all. If someone is perfectly happy being cis or otherwise normal, and their life was relatively peachy and gender never really crossed their mind, and then suddenly by influence of the internet or a trans person they knew or whatever the circumstances are that gave them the idea, they get depressed and isolate themselves in the name of gender dysphoria. That, to me, is a very clear sign that they were made to feel that way. It was very much coerced to think these thoughts now. You don't feel ashamed until somebody makes you feel ashamed. Shame is thinking, I am wrong. Like, I'm just wrong as a person. Whereas comparing it to, like, guilt, that would be, I did something wrong. There is an inner battle of, isn't it normal to have thoughts as a straight guy to want to be a lesbian? And I see that sort of thing kind of common in like just some of the transgender subreddits. I just need to say this. And it relates to shame, trust me. Guys don't talk with other guys about their fetishes, their paraphilias, their fantasies, because otherwise their buddies will think, oh, that's gross, that's weird, that's weak. So what winds up happening is that guys with AGP won't divulge their sexual concerns with their buddies at all, because they don't want to be bullied by or judged by their friends. Ergo, they believe that their sexuality is very unique to them, and they're the only people that have it. On top of that, they often fail to gently bring up their paraphilia with their female partner, who very likely judges them and fills him with shame that shame tends to lead individual onto the trans train. Once on that train, shame is masked by women have autogynephilia because they are turned on by their own bodies. Because I've seen plenty of women in the sex industry just get totally turned on by their own reflection. And what is masturbation but turned on by your own body? These are some of the arguments that I've seen on there. Really, if only these individuals knew that it's actually super normal to have these thoughts and fantasies and still be guys or cis dudes. I would compare it to when guys do, like straight guys do very often secretly ask themselves, am I gay? It's not weird. It's not shameful to consider these thoughts. It's so extremely normal that I just wish guys would just talk about it more. And girls too. Girls don't really talk about sexuality either. They'll talk about some things like, oh, I'm attracted to this boy, or oh, I'm attracted to this girl. They'll probably talk about something like that. But they won't go into the more like, ooh, paraphilia seems a little, maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I shouldn't talk about it. But in conclusion, trans egg culture highlights exactly what's wrong with transgenderism and how blatantly sexist and homophobic it is. Trans egg culture says that you can't be a guy and like frilly dresses and be submissive. Only girls do that. You can't be a girl and like monster trucks, have a buzz cut, and be dominant. Only boys do that. Trans egg culture barely even suggests alternatives and only enables gender exploration, thereby making people trans. Because if you don't say an alternative, then you're not saying, here, explore like all avenues of it and you have free will to look into it. Trans egg culture pretty much takes free will and just chucks it out the window. Anyway, so one of my final words is, if you're watching this and you're trans and you're kind of scared because you're starting to maybe doubt your trans identification, and I mean, maybe I'm being a little blunt, but I don't see why you should be afraid, because I don't understand exactly what you could lose that you haven't already lost by being trans identified. I mean, if you were scared of being trans to begin with, why would you be scared of not being trans? I don't think there's anything to lose or necessarily to gain. I just find it to be very neutral. And there's nothing wrong with exploring, like the trans community says there's nothing wrong with exploring your gender, so looking into detransitioning potentially, that would be further looking into your gender and just discovering yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that. It might be daunting, and especially if you've already done the medical path. Yeah, like that's really scary, but there's still life after detransitioning. There's nothing. I can see why there's some scariness to it, but if there's a will, there's a way, is basically what I can conclude on that. Anyway, it's getting dark. I've talked long enough. I'm signing off. Goodbye.